"Sir, you do not belong here." The words were not loud, but they were sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of the private terminal lounge, and every conversation within a 10-foot radius seemed to pause just long enough to register what had been said, even if no one openly reacted, and Marcus Ellington stood there, unmoved, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, as if the sentence had passed through the air without ever reaching him. The polished marble floors reflecting the soft golden lighting above, while the scent of expensive coffee lingered faintly in the background, and Daniel Brooks, the lounge manager, adjusted his stance slightly, his badge catching the light as he folded his hands in front of him with practiced authority, his tone controlled but unmistakably dismissive. "This is a restricted VIP area, sir, and access requires verified membership," he added, his gaze briefly scanning Marcus from head to toe in a way that was quick but deliberate, the kind of glance that carried judgment without needing explanation, and Marcus did not respond immediately. He simply looked past Daniel for a brief second, taking in the quiet elegance of the lounge, the leather seating, the travelers in tailored suits, the staff moving with quiet efficiency, before returning his attention to the man in front of him, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "I see," he said, not questioning, not challenging, just acknowledging, and that calmness seemed to unsettle the moment more than any argument could have, because Daniel's posture stiffened slightly, as if expecting resistance that never came, and instead receiving something he could not immediately categorize, and a woman seated nearby lowered her glass just enough to glance in their direction, her curiosity subtle but present, while a man standing by the espresso bar slowed his movement, pretending to check his phone while listening closely, and Daniel cleared his throat, reinforcing his position. "If you do not have a valid pass, I am going to have to ask you to step away from the entrance," he said, his tone still professional, but now carrying a faint edge of impatience, as if the situation should have already resolved itself, and Marcus tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in consideration, his eyes meeting Daniel's without tension, without urgency. "Who manages this lounge?" he asked quietly, the question simple, almost casual, yet it lingered in the space between them in a way that shifted the dynamic just enough to be felt, and Daniel frowned, just slightly, the smallest crack in his controlled expression. "I do," he replied, a hint of pride entering his voice, as if reaffirming his authority within this environment, and Marcus nodded once, slowly, as if noting something important, his composure unchanged, and behind Daniel, one of the junior staff members glanced toward a nearby terminal screen, their fingers hovering for a moment before tapping lightly, as if checking something they had not needed to check before, and the atmosphere, though still quiet, began to shift in a way that could not yet be explained, a subtle tension threading through the polished calm of the lounge. And Daniel took a small step forward, closing the space just enough to reassert control. "Sir, I am going to need you to comply," he said, and this time the words carried more weight, more finality, but Marcus did not move, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, steady and composed, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere beyond what anyone in the room could currently see. And that stillness, more than anything else, made the situation impossible to ignore. Daniel Brooks held his position, but something about the stillness in front of him no longer felt like compliance. It felt like control, and Marcus Ellington remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, as if the space around him had shifted without requiring him to move at all, and the quiet murmur of the lounge did not fully return this time, instead lingering just beneath the surface. Conversations half resumed, but attention still anchored to the entrance where the moment had not yet resolved, and Daniel adjusted his stance again, a subtle shift meant to reinforce authority. But the movement lacked the same confidence it had carried seconds before, because the expected reaction had not come. There was no argument to shut down, no resistance to correct. Only a calm presence that seemed to absorb the pressure without reacting to it. And that absence created something far more difficult to manage. And he spoke again, his tone slightly firmer. "Sir, I am not going to repeat myself," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "This area is reserved for authorized guests only." And Marcus listened, not interrupting, not reacting, simply allowing the statement to settle. his expression neutral, almost reflective, as if considering something beyond the immediate exchange. And then he asked, his voice even, "How is authorization verified?" And the question was precise, not confrontational, yet it redirected the interaction in a way that Daniel had not anticipated, because it shifted the focus from exclusion to process, from authority to structure. And Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Through our system," he said, gesturing lightly toward the terminal behind him, "registered members are checked in through the database." And Marcus nodded once, slowly, as if confirming a detail. "And that system is current?" he asked, his tone unchanged, and Daniel's expression tightened slightly, the question sounding simple, but carrying an implication he could not immediately place. "Of course it is," he replied, a hint of defensiveness entering his voice, and behind him, the same junior staff member who had glanced at the screen earlier now stepped closer to the terminal, their movements quiet but deliberate, as if drawn by something they could not ignore, and the faint tapping of keys broke the stillness for a moment, subtle but noticeable. And a man seated near the window lowered his newspaper just enough to watch more openly now, his curiosity no longer disguised, while a woman by the coffee station turned slightly, her attention fully engaged despite her attempt to appear casual, and Daniel noticed the shift, the way the room was no longer passively observing but actively waiting, and it unsettled him in a way he could not openly acknowledge, because the authority he held relied on control, and control depends on predictability. And nothing about this moment felt predictable anymore, and he stepped forward again, closing the distance just enough to re-establish presence. "If you cannot provide valid credentials, I will have to escalate this," he said, his voice steady but carrying a new layer of urgency, and Marcus met his gaze without change, without resistance. "You should do what you believe is appropriate," he replied, the words calm, almost indifferent, yet carrying a weight that did not match their simplicity, and that weight lingered, because it did not challenge Daniel's authority directly, it allowed it, and in doing so, it placed the responsibility entirely in his hands, and that shift, subtle as it was, altered the dynamic again, because authority exercised without certainty begins to feel exposed, and behind them, the quiet tapping at the terminal slowed, then stopped, and the staff member's posture changed, just slightly, as if something on the screen had caught their full attention, and though no one spoke, the atmosphere in the lounge tightened once more, not with conflict, but with anticipation, as if the next moment would reveal something that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. The shift in the air was subtle, but it was no longer invisible. It moved through the lounge in the way people held their breath just a second longer, in the way eyes lingered instead of looking away, and Marcus Ellington remained exactly where he stood, his presence unchanged, as if the growing tension around him had nothing to attach itself to, and behind Daniel Brooks, the junior staff member stared at the terminal screen with a focus that had sharpened into something unmistakable, their fingers no longer moving, their posture slightly rigid as if what they were seeing required confirmation not from the system, but from themselves, and Daniel noticed it, not immediately, but just enough for it to register as an interruption to the control he was trying to maintain, and he turned his head slightly. His voice lowered but edged with impatience. "Is there an issue?" he asked, and the staff member hesitated, their eyes flicking between the screen and Marcus, then back again, as if connecting 2 points that had not been meant to meet in this way. And that hesitation did more than any answer could have. It signaled uncertainty, and uncertainty in a controlled environment spreads quickly, and Daniel straightened, redirecting his focus back to Marcus, his tone tightening as he tried to regain the structure of the moment. "This is not complicated," he said. "You either have access or you do not." And Marcus listened, his expression calm, his gaze steady, offering no resistance, no urgency, only a quiet patience that seemed to allow the situation to unfold without interference, and that patience began to carry its own weight. Because it suggested that time was not working against him, it was working for him, and a man near the window leaned slightly forward in his seat, no longer pretending to read, while the woman by the coffee station set her cup down slowly, her attention fully engaged now, and the room, though still outwardly composed, had shifted into something else entirely, something that waited rather than moved, and Daniel took another step closer, narrowing the space again, his voice firmer. "I am asking you one last time to step away," he said, and this time the statement carried a finality that was meant to end the interaction. But Marcus did not move, did not respond immediately. He simply held Daniel's gaze for a brief moment before speaking, his tone even. "Then you should proceed," he said, and the words, simple as they were, carried a quiet certainty that did not align with the situation as Daniel understood it. And that misalignment created a crack, small but undeniable, and behind them, the staff member finally spoke, their voice low but clear enough to interrupt the tension. "Sir," they said, directing the word not at Marcus, but at Daniel, and that alone shifted the dynamic, because the direction of attention had changed, and Daniel turned, irritation ready in his expression, but it paused, just slightly, when he saw the look on the staff member's face, not confusion, not hesitation, but something closer to realization, and the terminal screen reflected faintly in their eyes, and though the words had not yet been spoken, the room felt it, the sense that something fundamental had just been uncovered, something that would not fit within the structure Daniel had been enforcing, and Marcus remained still, composed, as if the moment he had been waiting for had already begun to arrive, not through force, not through argument, but through the quiet alignment of truth with recognition. The word hung in the air just long enough to change everything, not because it was loud, but because of who it was directed to, and Daniel Brooks turned fully now, his irritation ready to surface, but it stalled when he saw the expression on the junior staff member's face, not confusion, not uncertainty, but something more precise, something that carried weight, and the staff member stepped closer, lowering their voice instinctively. Yet the shift in posture alone was enough to draw attention, because the direction of authority had begun to move, and that movement was visible even before it was explained, and Marcus Ellington remained still, his composure unchanged, his gaze steady, as if the unfolding moment required nothing from him except presence, and the staff member spoke again, more carefully this time. "Sir, there may be an issue with the system record," they said, choosing each word with caution, and Daniel frowned immediately, the statement landing as a challenge to his control rather than a clarification. "There is no issue," he replied, his tone firm, almost dismissive, as if certainty alone could correct whatever doubt had been introduced. But the staff member did not step back, did not retract the statement, instead glancing once more at the screen behind them before returning their attention to Daniel. "The name is in the system," they added, and that sentence, simple as it was, created a shift that could not be undone, because it introduced a contradiction, and contradiction in a structured environment demands resolution, and the guests nearby felt it, the subtle tightening of the atmosphere. The way attention sharpened without movement, and Daniel's posture stiffened, his authority now intersecting with something he could not immediately control. "Then verify it properly," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, but carrying a strain that had not been there before, and the staff member nodded, turning back to the terminal, their fingers moving quickly now, more deliberate, more certain, and the faint glow of the screen reflected in their focused expression, and for a brief moment, the room held still, not silent, but suspended, as if waiting for something that had already begun to reveal itself, and Marcus watched without urgency, without interest in accelerating the moment, his stillness now functioning as a kind of anchor, grounding the space as everything else shifted around him, and Daniel glanced back at him, searching for something, a reaction, a sign, anything that would re-establish the balance he had been holding. But Marcus offered nothing beyond calm attention, and that absence became its own answer, because it suggested that the outcome was not uncertain, only delayed, and the staff member paused suddenly, their hands stopping mid-motion, their eyes fixed on the screen with a clarity that replaced all earlier hesitation. And though they had not yet spoken, the change was visible, unmistakable, and Daniel saw it, the way their posture aligned, the way their focus sharpened, and for the first time since the interaction began, his certainty faltered, not outwardly, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough to be felt, and the staff member turned slowly, their voice steady now, no longer tentative. "Sir," they said again. And this time the word carried a different meaning, not just attention, but confirmation, and the room responded to it in the smallest ways, a shift in stance, a pause in movement, a collective awareness that the moment had crossed into something new, something irreversible, and Marcus remained exactly where he was, composed and unshaken, as if everything unfolding had always been part of a sequence he did not need to control, because it was already aligned. The word confirmation did not arrive with volume. It arrived with certainty, and that difference changed everything. Because when the junior staff member spoke again, their voice no longer carried hesitation, it carried alignment. The profile is verified, they said quietly, and the sentence did not need to be repeated. It moved through the immediate space with a clarity that restructured the moment in real time. And Daniel Brooks stood still for a fraction longer than expected, his expression holding its form, but something beneath it shifting, recalculating, because the system he had relied on had not supported him. It had contradicted him, and contradiction in a position of authority creates a gap that cannot be easily closed. And he turned slightly toward the terminal, as if the screen itself might offer a different answer if viewed from another angle. But the staff member did not step aside, did not yield the space, their posture steady now, grounded in what they had already confirmed, and Marcus Ellington remained exactly where he was, his presence unchanged, his expression calm, as if the unfolding correction required no input from him, only time, and the guests nearby felt the shift deepen. The earlier curiosity now replaced by a quiet awareness that something more significant was happening, something that extended beyond a simple misunderstanding, and Daniel's voice returned, but it was different now, still controlled, but carrying a strain that had not been there before. Then there is a discrepancy, he said, the words chosen carefully, as if reframing the situation might restore the balance. But the staff members shook their heads slightly, not in defiance, but in clarity. There is no discrepancy, they replied, and that response landed with more weight than any raised voice could have, because it removed ambiguity, and without ambiguity, authority must adjust. And Daniel's gaze flickered briefly toward Marcus, searching again for something that would ground the interaction in familiar terms. But Marcus offered nothing beyond composed attention, his stillness now functioning as a fixed point in a room that was beginning to reorganize itself, and behind the desk, another staff member stepped closer, their presence subtle but deliberate, as if responding to an unspoken signal, and the shift in staffing, small as it was, reinforced what had already begun to change, because structure reveals itself through movement, not announcements, and Daniel felt it. The way the environment no longer aligned entirely with him, the way attention had started to move past him rather than through him, and that realization, though not visible in a single gesture, settled into his posture, tightening it, refining it, as he tried to maintain control of a moment that was no longer fully his. And Marcus spoke again, his voice even, unhurried. "Then you have everything you need," he said, and the statement, simple as it was, carried a finality that did not require emphasis, because it pointed not to argument, but to conclusion, and the room responded to it in the smallest ways, a shift in stance, a pause in motion, a collective recognition that the situation had moved beyond uncertainty, and Daniel remained where he stood, but his position had changed, not physically, but structurally, because the authority he had been exercising was no longer the dominant force in the space. And that change, subtle yet undeniable, marked the point where control had begun to transfer, not through confrontation, but through alignment with something larger, something already established. And as that alignment continued to settle, the next step of the moment approached, no longer hidden, no longer delayed, but inevitable. The transition did not announce itself, it revealed itself through movement, through the way one presence entered the space, and everything else adjusted in response. And the senior operations director stepped into the lounge with quiet authority, their pace measured, their posture aligned with purpose rather than urgency. And the moment they crossed the threshold, the dynamic shifted again, not abruptly, but decisively, as if the structure of the environment had just been reaffirmed at a higher level. And Daniel Brooks noticed immediately, his shoulders tightening slightly as recognition replaced uncertainty, because this was no longer a situation he could contain within his own authority, and the director's gaze moved across the room with calm precision before settling on Marcus Ellington. And that single point of focus carried more weight than any introduction, because it acknowledged something that had already been confirmed elsewhere, and Marcus remained still, composed, his expression unchanged, as if the arrival did not alter his position, it simply validated it, and the director inclined their head slightly, a gesture subtle but unmistakable. "Mr. Ellington," they said, their tone professional, but carrying a level of respect that reframed the entire interaction, and the room felt it instantly. The way acknowledgement reorders perception, the way a name, used correctly, can realign everything around it. And Daniel stood just behind, his position now complicated by the presence of someone whose authority extended beyond his own. And the director turned slightly toward him, not confrontational, not abrupt, but clear. "We will handle this," they said, and the statement was not a suggestion. It was a transition of control, delivered without escalation, without the need for emphasis, and Daniel nodded once, a movement that carried compliance even if it lacked comfort, because the moment had moved beyond him, and the staff nearby adjusted their posture almost immediately. The earlier hesitation replaced by alignment, as if the system that had been quietly correcting itself had now reached its final confirmation point, and Marcus took a single step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, simply continuing in a direction that had already been established, and the path ahead of him cleared naturally, not because anyone had been told to move, but because the environment had already adapted to his presence, and the guests watched, not openly, but with a level of attention that no longer needed to be concealed, because the narrative they had assumed at the beginning had shifted completely, and Daniel remained where he stood, his authority no longer central, his role reduced not through confrontation, but through redefinition, and the director walked beside Marcus now, their presence reinforcing the alignment that had been building throughout the moment. And as they approached the entrance to the lounge, the space itself seemed to settle into a new equilibrium, one where access was no longer questioned, where position was no longer assumed, and Marcus moved forward with the same calm composure he had carried from the start, because nothing about him had changed, only the way the room understood him, and that understanding, once corrected, did not require further explanation. It simply guided what happened next. The shift was complete the moment Marcus Ellington crossed the threshold, not because anyone announced it, but because the space responded in a way that left no room for interpretation. The ambient tension that had lingered at the entrance dissolved into a quiet, structured calm, and the VIP lounge revealed itself fully, not just as a place of exclusivity, but as an environment that recognized alignment when it saw it. And Marcus moved forward with the same measured pace, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, as if nothing about the last several minutes had required adjustment, because for him, it had not, and the senior operations director remained just slightly behind and to his side, a position that did not overshadow, but reinforced, signaling clearly to anyone observing that the hierarchy had already been established. And the staff inside the lounge adjusted almost immediately, one attendant stepping forward with a respectful nod, another preparing a seating area without needing to be instructed, their movements smooth, coordinated, as if guided by an understanding that had just been clarified rather than created, and Marcus acknowledged the gestures with a subtle inclination of his head, nothing exaggerated, nothing performative, just enough to complete the exchange, and behind them, near the entrance, Daniel Brooks remained still, his position now separated from the center of the moment, not physically removed, but functionally repositioned, and that distinction mattered, because it demonstrated that authority does not always shift through removal, sometimes it shifts through irrelevance. And the guests who had been watching earlier now returned to their seats, but not to their previous assumptions, their conversations quieter, more deliberate, as if recalibrating around what they had just witnessed, and a man near the window lifted his glass slightly, his gaze following Marcus for a moment longer before turning away, while the woman by the coffee station resumed her movement, but with a different awareness, the subtle acknowledgement that the narrative had not unfolded the way it first appeared, and Marcus took his seat in the lounge, the space around him settling naturally, as if it had always been intended for him. And the director spoke briefly with a nearby staff member, their tone low, controlled, not corrective, but precise. ensuring that the structure moving forward aligned with what had just been confirmed. And though no one raised their voice, though no dramatic statement was made, the outcome was unmistakable, because the room itself had accepted it. And acceptance at that level does not require explanation. It requires recognition, and recognition had already occurred. And Marcus, seated now, glanced once toward the entrance, not lingering, not seeking acknowledgement, simply observing the space as it continued to reorganize itself in quiet alignment. And then his attention returned forward, composed, focused, as if the moment had already served its purpose. And what followed would simply continue from that point without interruption, without resistance, because the shift had already taken place, and nothing in the room could return to what it had been before. The room did not need an announcement to understand what had just taken place. It understood through alignment, through the way every detail now moved with quiet precision, and Marcus Ellington sat within that alignment as if it had always belonged to him, his presence steady, his posture unchanged. And across the lounge, the senior operations director concluded a brief exchange with the staff before turning slightly, their voice calm but clear enough to reach the necessary ears. Ensure all executive profiles are flagged correctly moving forward, they said, and the instruction was not reactive, it was corrective, addressing the system rather than the moment, and that distinction mattered, because it confirmed that what had occurred was not an exception, it was a failure in recognition. And failures in recognition are corrected at the structural level, not the emotional one, and the staff nodded in unison, their movements immediate, precise, as if the directive had simply activated a protocol already in place. And near the entrance, Daniel Brooks remained positioned just outside the center of the space, no longer the focal point, but not yet removed. His posture held in a controlled stillness that now felt less like authority and more like containment, and the director's attention shifted toward him briefly, not with confrontation, not with visible judgment, but with a level of clarity that did not require elaboration. We will review this after, they said, and the sentence, measured and neutral, carried a weight that extended beyond the present moment, because it placed what had happened into a larger context. One where actions are evaluated based on alignment with structure, not personal interpretation, and Daniel inclined his head slightly, the movement subtle, controlled, but unmistakably compliant, and the guests who had observed the interaction earlier now returned fully to their routines, yet something in the atmosphere remained altered, a quiet awareness that the environment they were part of operated on rules that extended beyond what was immediately visible, and Marcus reached for the glass of water placed before him, his movement unhurried, natural, as if the moment that had unfolded had required no adjustment from him at all. And in a way, it had not, because his position had not changed, only the room's understanding of it had, and the director approached once more, stopping just within conversational distance, their tone low. Respectful. Everything is set, they said, not as a question, but as confirmation, and Marcus gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without extending it, because nothing further needed to be said. And that economy of words reinforced the balance that had been established, and as the director stepped away, the structure of the lounge settled completely into its new state, one where roles were clearly defined, where authority was aligned with truth rather than assumption, and where the earlier tension had been replaced not with relief, but with clarity, and that clarity carried forward into every movement, every interaction, shaping the space in a way that could not be reversed. Because once recognition occurs, it does not disappear, it remains, influencing everything that follows with quiet, undeniable consistency. The moment did not end with a reaction, it settled into a quiet conclusion that carried more weight than any raised voice could have, and Marcus Ellington remained seated, composed, his presence steady within the now fully aligned space. As the lounge continued to function around him with seamless precision, every movement calibrated, every interaction grounded in the clarity that had been established, and near the entrance, the final shift began to take shape, not through confrontation, but through process. As the senior operations director returned, their pace measured, their focus clear, and they stopped just within Daniel Brooks's line of sight, their tone calm, controlled. "We need to speak," they said, and the words were not an escalation, they were a transition, moving the situation from public misalignment to private resolution. And Daniel nodded, his posture still composed, but no longer anchored in authority, instead reflecting a position that had already been redefined. And as he stepped aside to follow, the distinction became complete, not because anyone had declared it, but because the structure of the environment had already adjusted, and those who had observed the interaction earlier understood it without needing explanation, because the sequence had revealed itself step by step, from assumption to correction to consequence. And Marcus did not watch them leave, did not follow the outcome, because his role in the moment had never been to enforce the result. It had been to stand within the truth of his position, and that had already been done. And across the lounge, the guests resumed their conversations fully now, but the tone had changed, quieter, more deliberate, as if shaped by an awareness that had not been present before, and the staff moved with renewed precision, their actions no longer influenced by uncertainty, but by alignment with what had been confirmed. And the director returned shortly after, their expression neutral, their focus steady, and they approached Marcus once more, stopping at a respectful distance. "It has been handled," they said, and the sentence, simple and direct, carried the finality of a completed process. Not dramatic, not extended, just clear, and Marcus acknowledged it with a slight nod, his expression unchanged, because nothing about the outcome required adjustment from him. It had always been moving toward this point, and the director added, "We appreciate your patience." And Marcus's response came with the same calm clarity that had defined every moment before. "It is expected," he said, and the words, understated and precise, closed the loop without reopening it. And the director inclined their heads slightly before stepping away, allowing the space to continue without interruption. And as Marcus sat there, the lounge around him settled fully into its natural rhythm, one where access was no longer questioned, where presence was correctly understood, and where the events that had unfolded became part of the environment's quiet memory, shaping future interactions in ways that would not need to be repeated, because once clarity is established, it remains, guiding everything that follows with a steady, undeniable influence that requires no reinforcement, only recognition.